Hi, I'm Femi OK and you're in the stream. Today, rethinking capitalism starting in the classroom. We'll look at the movement that's calling for a more critical eye on Western economic systems and their global impact. So welcome to the Stream Economics class. Stay with us for the next 30 minutes. Could be educational. Okay, Malika Bilal, I didn't take economics, you did, so yes. I'm going to be in your very safe hands. Malika's like, I don't think so.
Right.
What's the community saying?
I am in safe hands with them. They have a lot to say. A lot of them are critical, though. They're looking at this with the critical lens, and this is one such tweet. This is from Professor Ray, and he references a report out from Oxfam this week. The world's richest 1% will own more than the other 99% by next year. And he links to a cartoon by Nick Anderson showing an executive on a pile of money looking down at someone asking for the minimum wage to be raised. So we'll discuss what's behind that cartoon and that idea in today's show. We want your help, so tweet us with #AJStream.
Now, right here in the studio we have Phil Magnus, and Phil studies capitalism and US history at George Mason University. Phil, it's great to have you here. Welcome.
Great to be here.
We're going to hear more from you in just a moment. First, a little bit of background though to this subject. Western capitalism has been credited for economic growth and blamed by its critics for a whole host of problems like worsening climate change, income inequality, financial instability. After traditional economists were caught off guard by the last global financial crisis, a growing movement is now calling on universities to add more diverse economic studies, especially those that take a critical look at free market capitalism. So is it time to shake up the way that we teach economics and look at alternatives to capitalism? Here to help us talk about this, we have Julie Mathai. She is an economics professor at Wellesley College in Massachusetts. In Chicago.
Hi, great to be here.
Hi there, Julie. Good to have you. Sebastian Gay is an economics lecturer at the University of Chicago.
Hi.
Hello. In
Nice
New
to be
York,
here.
it's good to have you. In New York, Keith Harrington, activist with the Kick It Over campaign, which calls for more alternative studies in economics. Hello there, Keith.
Hi.
So it's good to have you all here in the mix. Let me start first of all with, if I were going to take an economics class today, if I was going to study, Julie, what would be in the curriculum for me? What would I be taught?
Well, pretty much in 99.9% of the classrooms in the U.S., you would have what we call neoclassical economics. I call it mainstream economics.
Yeah.
You'd have the basic supply and demand, firms maximizing profit, consumers maximizing utility. And it's a model that pretty much sees our economy as the best economy, the basically only efficient way to do it.
Yeah.
And describes allocation of resources and focuses on scarcity.
Okay. Anything wrong with that, Phil?
Well, you know, I'd look to the history of the past 300 years or so.
Yeah.
And if we look at the living conditions of the average human being today,
yeah.
Compared to that to like a king or an emperor 300 years ago, and in many respects, many metrics, that person today has it better off. And I think there's a reason
So
for
I'm
that.
living better than an emperor did 200 years ago?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay, that's pretty cool. So that model that we're using right now to teach young economists, nothing wrong with that model. You think we're doing much better now anyway?
So I don't think it's a perfect model
Right.
in every sense. I think it's a conceptual tool that's very useful for
Right.
understanding some of these phenomena.
Sure.
And if we look at the last 300 years of human technological growth, the expansion of wealth worldwide, I think there's a direct connection to some of those conceptual underpinnings that we have.
Okay, Malika?
Well, you mentioned it's not a perfect model,
Right.
and there are people that definitely agree with you here. So Cicely says there's not enough application of this in real world. So she writes in, it should be taught with realistic problem solving. It should be taught with respect for labor and workers, and respect for limited resources and our endangered environment. So a lot of things wrapped up in there. And Keith, I'm wondering for your thoughts on that. Do you think that there are holes in the way that economics is currently taught?
Yeah, I mean, what I would speak to is the limitations that mainstream economics has when it comes to looking at the environment and environmental crises. I think mainstream economics has a very weak view of sustainability, a weak understanding of sustainability, central to the concept of mainstream environmental economics is this idea of substitutability, and this basically says that if you have an ecosystem, if you have a species, it's all right to go and destroy that, it's all right to go and deplete it, as long as you are compensating for that loss with investments in capital somewhere else in the economy. And that would leave many ecological scientists, many environmental scientists to scratch their heads. There is an alternative view called ecological economics, and that has a much stronger conception of what sustainability is, one that's actually informed by ecological sciences, by environmental science, and it practices what's known as the precautionary principle. It looks at the fact that we are, on the brink of collapse when it comes to a variety of different planetary systems, from the climate system to biodiversity and so forth. And it says that we should be working, exercising caution, erring on the side of caution, and doing all that we can to preserve those systems, keep them intact, understanding that there are particular arrangements of those systems, particular balances within them, particular species that we can't just go and destroy without courting catastrophe.
Keith, take a breath for a moment. Take a breath for a moment, because I want to bring Sebastian in. He's a lecturer. Sebastian, does what Keith's saying make sense? Is that practical to teach more about the environment and environmental impact as you're teaching your economics students?
Well, the issue I have with that is that the way you want to teach students is first give them like a framework. I might agree that it might not be all the time like a perfect framework, but making them think about issues using an economics framework first, and then students can go and do real-life applications, and they exist. You just use data, and our students do those sorts of studies, and so they might find out that there's an economic impact of some, EPA measure, and they just, go and collect data and just find out whether or not there's a potential issue. But what matters is the economics of, incentives. That's the way I would like to think about it.
Economics of incentive. Well, there's like you make more.
I could jump in.
Yeah, go ahead, Julie.
Yeah.
I could jump in because the concepts you use to look at the economy actually are extremely important. So once you have certain concepts, like mainstream economics looks at nature as resources. They're just resources to be used, and it assumes that the market is going to allocate them efficiently, and if not, the government will come and fix it. And it also has no idea of class, because everyone's just an individual selling resources. So when your writer, the tweeter person asked about workers, there aren't any workers in the mainstream economic paradigm because they see everyone as individuals, and so you can't really analyze class.
And if I could just jump in.
Picking up on what she said, I just want to pick up on what she mentioned there, because someone just tweeted in, Gabriel says he's an economics professor, and he says, I always encourage my students to look around any human relationship through their econ eyes. And I guess more can always be done. What would looking at the world through economic eyes look like?
Well, I'd say look at institutions. Look at institutions that govern resource allocation. That could include anything from, if we choose to pursue, say, a government solution to an environmental issue, what are some of the political consequences of that?
Can you give us an example? Because everybody will go, oh, yes, I know what you're talking about, Phil, now.
Yeah, absolutely. So say you have a really scarce resource, and you're trying to evaluate whether to regulate, either the preservation of that resource, or you're trying to...
So this is hypothetical. Can you make it something that actually we can relate to? I'm putting you on the spot.
Like a carbon tax.
Sure, yeah.
Carbon tax would be carbon tax.
Yeah, carbon tax would be a very interesting example.
Yeah.
And we talk about these ideas. If you view carbon as a pollutant, something that needs to be restricted in number, the idea is you put a tax on it and reduce consumption.
Yeah, but to be fair, also,
Sebastian,
it's a beautiful idea, and they're right about that. The problem is, the policy is great, but the problem is mainstream theory doesn't look at the fact that very wealthy interests and corporations have a lot more say in how policies are made than the everyday American or worker or even economist, so that these wonderful policies that many mainstream economists support are not getting executed or even voted in because of the control of vested interests over the political process.
If I could jump in on that, I actually agree with that point.
All right, so Phil agrees. Hold tight for a minute, guests. I'm just going to do a little bit of traffic copying here. Sebastian, you go first, and then Keith, I'll come back to you. Sebastian?
Yeah, I just wanted to tell Julie that there's also market solutions for those, right? I mean, if you're You know, there's like that theory of the cost theorem, that you give like the property rights to someone, and then you end up having also a market equilibrium. And institutions are there to just like punish firms that are not doing like the right things. But at the end of the day, it's the role of a regulator to step in. It's not as economists that we can do that. It's not our role. I think our role is to explain some phenomenon, and then based on that, they are politicians, regulators, lawmakers that then make decisions.
Okay, Keith.
Yep.
But the problem is that we, mainstream economics has its own particular tools for recommending policy directions on something like climate change, for instance. So, we have what's called the Pigovian tax, putting a tax to try to internalize the externalities of carbon pollution, to try to bring them back into the market
sure,
and set up price signals.
If you let
me continue.
You said
and then there's
So, gentlemen, Keith, finish up quickly, because we have to go backwards and forwards, because we don't have an hour. We have less than an hour. So you make your point quickly. Sebastian will come back, and then we'll move on.
And as we've seen, that's very subject to a lot of very subjective analysis when it comes to developing a discount formula. I know I'm getting into jargon here, but
all right. So get us out, Keith, in a sentence, and then I'm going to move over to Sebastian.
That's a subjective approach, and ecological economics has a different approach, which would be to see that there is an overall limit on the amount of carbon that we can put into the atmosphere, and to suggest something like a cap and dividend system for...
Good. Sebastian?
Okay, Keith, and so what I wanted to say is the fact that, as you mentioned, there's recommendations, and people like use theories and build up models to recommend some solutions, but it doesn't mean that they're correct, right? They need to be backed up by data, and some of them are invalidated, some of them are validated. So it's all about that. It's only about recommendations. So
right, so gentlemen, I'm going to move
I think that's the point, though. If the economy is such that
go ahead, Julie.
that the political system gets bought basically by the 1%, then economists have to take that into account, because that is what the economy is doing. The economy in capitalism is concentrating wealth to such an extent that individuality and individual freedom gets trumped by the 1%, and they end up purchasing the government, basically, in simple words, and then preventing policies like climate change prevention policies that the vast majority of people want.
All right,
or the increase in the minimum wage, which
I'm going to move things along just a little bit. Head over here to my laptop. This a poster I found on the Kick It Over campaign, which is looking at alternatives to the way we not only teach economics, but maybe the way we view capitalism and the world. And it starts off here: hey, economics professor, how come the financial meltdown of 2008 caught almost all of you academic policymakers and think tank flat-footed, shaking your heads in disbelief? So basically, how did you get it so wrong? Sebastian, I'm not blaming the whole of the recession on you or economic professors or economic lecturers, but there is a sort of big spotlight on you right now, the same as there was after the Great Depression, and a whole new lot of thought and thinking came out of the Great Depression. What's coming out of the recession, the global recession? What's new and exciting and interesting, or is it business as usual?
Well, you need to learn like what happened. So there's a lot of academic studies that will come out of it. Even if you say that people didn't, see it coming, it's not necessarily true, right? There were like bubbles. There was a market bubble where stocks were overvalued. There was like a home valuation bubble that people saw coming. So at a point in time, you knew there would be another recession. So
that's a bit different from a major global financial disaster. Sebastian.
Well, things happen and go out of hand, right? I mean, people just are getting scared, and at a time when everything goes into recession, when all of the bubbles burst at the same time, then you might imagine that there's some feeling of panic, right? These days, like, the financial market is going up and down, it's very erratic, but we're not entering a period of recession. So
what about rethinking? Yeah, go ahead, Keith.
So, I think it's important here to kind of step back and take a look at what it is that students around the world are actually calling for. We're calling for pluralism in economics. We're calling for a broadening of the schools of thought that are acceptable to be taught inside the economics classroom and that are debated over between economists. I think one of the problems leading up to the economic crisis is that a lot of the policy recommendations and advice are coming from people who are mainly situated within a particular school of thought that's not always terribly critical of the status quo.
Keith, are you saying it's their fault, Keith? If they had actually thought a little bit more broader, we wouldn't be recovering from a major financial disaster?
I'm saying the fault lies with just the general narrowness of the mainstream profession, and the solution comes from not taking sides or going into one camp or another and saying that my perspective is better than yours, but by bringing true debate and pluralism that is a variety of different perspectives back into the profession.
Keith, I'm going to read a tweet from someone who does agree with you. And Phil, I'll direct this to you. This is from Nestle Han, and she says, we don't need a master's degree in economics to work out that there is an even more widening gap between the very rich and the very poor. And someone else who's echoing what she said, this is Jane on Facebook, who wrote, if capitalism means that 1% of the population has more wealth than the rest of humanity, this person writes, then capitalism is not working. So is wealth inequality and income inequality, is that an inevitability of the capitalistic system that we're under right now?
I think it's an issue we need to be aware of. The question is, what do we do about it, or should we even do anything about it at all?
Should we?
Yeah, and the big question I'd ask to anyone who is interested in this, what's your proposed solution? And is that solution something that could be worse than the supposed cause itself?
Phil, that is a fantastic question. Julie?
I could give some answers. We could start with some of the basics, which would be to raise the minimum wage, which we've looked at a vast majority of studies find that that is not bad for the economy and for workers, and in fact it can help stimulate demand in the economy. We can start with job creation programs like we had in the 60s and 70s, where we actually, because the government needs to be the employer of last resort, everyone who wants a job should be able to have a job. And one of the big weaknesses of capitalism is it has not been able to deliver enough jobs for people who want to work and produce things that then they can consume. So it's a paradoxical contradiction in advanced capitalism that we definitely need to fix. The problem, again, is we have to deal with the concentration of wealth, which is has been throwing a wrench in the political process. If you look at our Congress, how hard it was for Barack Obama to get a stimulus through even during the worst recession in the last 50 years. So there's a lot of things that we can change, and if we take in insights from other theories, I think we'll get there a lot faster than if we just use
Julie,
the narrow
let me just check in with you very
lens.
quickly. Do you think that's your job as an economist to change the way people are thinking? Is that your role?
Well, I think we need to think differently as economists.
Right.
And I think economists do affect how people think, but I think economists, we're here to help solve the economic problems of the world. That's our goal. We're trying to make people better off. We're trying to serve the people. Most of my colleagues are like that, mainstream or not. The question is, what do we do now with all these economic crises? If we just look in the model with the ideas that we're here when we created the problems, we're not going to solve them. Like Einstein said, you can't solve a problem with the thinking that created it. So how are we going to find new ways? Well, number one, look at all the other theories that already exist. Number two, create dialogue, as Keith said. And number three, start creating new theories.
Sebastian, workable or not?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to bounce on what Julie said about the government needs to be the person providing work. What about leaving companies doing it and provide them incentives to do that? Because I think we all economists, so we all agree that incentives work. We might have a different framework to think about it, but incentives are, at the basis of it. So we just have to create more incentives.
I would agree with giving companies incentives. The problem is often, the subsidies we give to large companies, the companies aren't using them to create jobs. And often localities give big incentives for firms to locate there to bring jobs, and then 2 years later they move abroad. So we have to think about that. Some people think about creating worker cooperatives with the money, which then the workers own the firm, and they're not going to offshore. They're not going to close the firm, and they're going to maintain their jobs.
So on that last point, I don't know if I necessarily agree, but I think that you need to have the government looking more to fine companies that are not respecting what they said that they would do, which is hiring more people, providing good wages.
Absolutely.
All of those are things that I definitely agree with, but there's a room for the market and a strong room that the private sector needs to provide by just giving them the right incentives. And it might not just be tax breaks. It might be something else.
May I step in here?
Keith, go ahead.
And I think, we just want to go back again to the basic argument for pluralism here. It doesn't really sound like Phil or Sebastian, really disagree that we should have some robust debate back inside of our economics departments, that it shouldn't just be the narrow mainstream. And I think that, if you have, for instance, even come from a very strongly pro-market perspective, you can make an argument for pluralism by saying that our understanding of the market, of how it works, of what its limits are, of what its failures are, of what its strengths are, is only strengthened if we bring perspectives into the mix that are more critical than the mainstream.
Is this happening?
Yes.
I mean, what you said, the idea of if broader theories were looked at for when you were studying economy at school or university, we might not have got into such a big crisis back in 2008 and just after 2008. So is anyone listening to you? Are you on the fringe or are you mainstream? Is anyone going, oh, that's a good idea, post this most recent financial crisis, as they did after the Great Depression?
Well,
I can jump in if you want. Go ahead, Keith.
I don't think we've seen much of a shift in that direction yet, unfortunately.
How do people view you? Do people view you as he's a fringe person? I'm not paying any attention to him.
I think in a lot of economics departments and in a lot of the mainstream journals, people who are taking an alternative perspective, yes, they would be seen as a marginal group. But the fact of the matter is that there is a growing student movement around the world of people who have gone into school, like myself, following the crisis, who are looking for a broader variety of ideas. And we've started a global movement. There are 65 student organizations around the world right now, united under the banner of the International Student Initiative for Pluralism in Economics. And we've been very active since last year, starting debates within our economics programs, doing teach-ins, suggesting alternative curricular frameworks and so forth. So I think that there is a growing tendency to listen to us because we are more vocal than we've ever been, but we still do have a long ways to go.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, let me go back to Phil, because Phil, you look at history and economies at the same time.
Sure.
Where are we right now? What can we learn from where we are right now?
Well, I think we need to look at historical interventions that have been made. I mean, we went through the Great Depression.
Yeah.
There were very specific policy, we call them solutions. They didn't always play out as planned.
Right.
I mean, the Great Depression lasted a decade.
Yeah.
We look at some of the policy solutions that came about in the wake of the financial crisis.
Sure.
There was a stimulus that came through.
Are you seeing people doing that right now?
I think we have some element of introspection.
Okay.
So the financial crisis came along. It did catch some people off guard. I would say it caught government economists off guard. There were always people in other areas of the discipline that were skeptical.
Not these economists over here, the government economists. They got it wrong.
Well,
all right. Let's see what our online community is saying, Malika.
Well, a lot of them are talking about alternatives and what that could look like and if they're viable or not. So George shares these two tweets. He says, we do need a new system. We're still relying on black or white, outdated ideas from long ago. We need a system that, instead of assuming humans will do the right thing, that assumes that they will actually do the wrong thing, and then creates checks and balances for that.
So if I was going to go to university and study economics, what would you say to me? Would you advise me to or not?
I say do so, but study the political economy as well.
Okay.
Understand how all of these propositions interact with specific government policies.
Sure.
And that could be anything from taxes, it could be what's funded, how resources are allocated through the state.
Wow.
The state's a coercive mechanism. It takes money through taxation and it distributes
You
it.
almost convinced me to change my profession, but not quite.
Right.
Phil Magnus, Julie Mathai, Keith Harrington, Sebastian Gay. Absolutely, there's so much more conversation to be had. We are taking these guests to the post show. If you want to know what Julie says next, stream.aljazeera.com. See you there. Meanwhile, let me tell you about our next AJ Stream show. Muslims visiting the Holy Land are being called traitors by fellow Muslims. We'll tell you why and look at the online debate that's revolving around this quite controversial program. But we were doing that in the next AJ Stream. Stay with us. I'll see you online. Thanks for watching. Hello again, this is the Streams Online Post Show. We're talking about alternative perspectives on economics and free market capitalism. Let's get right back to that conversation. Julie, what did you want to add?
Well, what I wanted to add is I think that one of the biggest positives about bringing in alternative theories into the core of economic theory is the ability to think about other systems. Because the mainstream core takes the system as given, it assumes everyone is narrowly self-interested and materialistic and really can't cooperate and need to have inequality to be motivated. You've often heard about the trickle-down theory, and if you take away money from the wealthy, the 1%, then they won't invest, and then we'll all be worse off. So that model has very little room for looking at another system, whereas in fact, what I have seen as an economist is, and many economists in Latin America are noticing this, there's a whole new economy emerging alongside of capitalism right now in markets that we're starting to call the solidarity economy, that is full of, it's based in values of sharing, cooperation, sustainability, economic democracy, and equity. And you can look all across the world and see institutions, economic institutions growing up with these values at the core. And you can see governments putting in policies that are doing this. So it's very exciting. We're in a very exciting time. And if economists can open up to alternative theories, we can start really helping create these new institutions and find the ones that work and experiment with them and study them.
Sebastian, as you're listening to Julie there, do you feel some resistance to the way she's describing what's possible, or do you feel that that is what's happening in a lot of universities and a lot of schools where young students are actually learning about different economies?
I think students learn about it. I mean, I can talk about the University of Chicago. We provide students with a lot of resources to be able to look at every aspect of the economy. I mean, they read Marx. They don't read it in the economics program, but they read it in social sciences, for example. So they know about it. Do we teach models? We tend to teach models that have to do with perfect like competition, so what we call like free market. But we do because it's a good framework. But then you use that model and then you continue to do other like types of studies like behavioral economics, which is closer to what Julie was talking about, which is very useful to analyze on a small scale what is the effect of a particular set of incentives. So I think we're talking in the same language in a way. We have the same type of ideas in terms of incentives. We just don't necessarily agree on the types of framework that is at the base of all of it.
And Julie, you mentioned those models and alternatives. There is one problem that someone in our community brought up that they see, and this is on Twitter. Toshido says, importantly, any alternative to Western capitalism in the developing world is nothing more than economic suicide, and they list an example as Zimbabwe there. Do you think that's accurate, Julie?
Wow, I mean, I could say exactly the opposite. I think that capitalism has been really problematic for many southern countries. There's been a few that have done well, but basically there's incredibly widespread poverty in the midst of incredible wealth in the world. And you think of the technology we have, and you think of all the people without their basic needs met, people even without food or health care or any education in the world after all these years of capitalism and all the potential for abundance. To me, it's just a signal exactly that we need to be looking at new models, new systems.
But it doesn't mean that what we teach is wrong, right? I mean, it just means that there's perhaps extra models that might not apply to a particular type.
I actually agree. I think that the mainstream model is excellent in terms of looking at within the box, within the system, what are the incentives, what makes things work, what is the effect of a tax on people, all of those, many great models that are made. It's just a lack of opening up the discourse to a larger set of questions, and a discourse that allows you to realize that people can change. If you have a system where they're being rewarded for being socially responsible, then they're going to be more socially responsible. And if firms are rewarded for being socially responsible, and if people are in cooperative institutions rather than having to fight with each other for their jobs and their livelihoods, they're going to be much more cooperative. So we have a cooperative side to human nature that has been assumed in mainstream economics usually to not exist. And we're finding all over the world, and even through history, and we have our guest here as a historian, many examples historically where people cooperated and did very well.
Julie, I'm really fascinated by this economists as activists. I want to bring Keith back into this conversation here. Keith, is it because you have a passion that was really around sort of the environment and climate change that drove you to economics? Is that the only way that you can kind of see, this is how I'm going to get it fixed? I have to get inside economics in order to get it fixed. Or is this idea of the activist and economist, is that quite widespread?
I don't think so, and I think that's one that we're really trying to promote through the campaign Kick It Over that we're organizing at Adbusters, which is that, you know, economists don't really tend to see themselves as in the role of activists. I know that even amongst the student community that is organizing around bringing pluralism into economics, there's some reluctance to get out there and do what we did at the American Economics Association conference.
Sure, I've got a little tweet here. I'm going to share it. It's the Economics Meme Wars, and it's hashtag Kick It Over. And here we've got, is economic growth killing the planet? Was that your work there, Keith?
That was my work there.
Yeah. Tell us.
And that's a series. We have a series of different posters and different memes that we're trying to get out there, encouraging students to put these types of questions around their economics departments to try to stoke debate.
Sure.
And that's really, again, that's at the core of what we're trying to do. We went and we were a little confrontational and disruptive at the conference because there's a real kind of small box in terms of what the acceptable
forums. What did you do? What's confrontational? Did you go through talks and lectures and take them over? How much confrontation went on?
No, we went to some lectures where we felt there was a real kind of one-sided debate occurring, between the right and the left of the mainstream, as opposed to bringing in voices from the heterodox community, such as Gregory Mankiw's debate over Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century. That was a panel that was primarily composed of a lot of right-wing voices, and then Thomas Piketty, who leans towards heterodoxy, but is still very much, his analysis is inside the mainstream. So we stood up to say, that there's not enough
Keith, I'm going to let you get away with all of those references because you're going to finish this sentence right now before we get into any more.
So we stepped in and we said that we need to bring more voices into this, and we knew that we probably wouldn't be called on to ask a question.
Did security kick you out?
No, security didn't kick us out.
Right.
But what we're trying to demonstrate again is to students that you have to have the courage to stand up and speak truth to power sometimes.
Wow.
Speak truth to professors.
I never think of an economics student ever having to do that. Are your professors, do they love you or hate you?
Well, thankfully I had the...
Sebastian's like, I'm so glad I'm in Chicago.
Well, hopefully we'll have a activist group set up on the University of Chicago.
Oh, Sebastian, coming to you. Kick it over to Chicago. I know Phil wanted to jump in here. Keith, just take a breath there. We get the sense of where your passion is, and you're feeling like you have to take action, basically. To broaden the debate. Phil, what's your take on that?
I am respectful of people having ideas they want to bring to bear to that debate. I'd simply urge students out there are channels to go through. You can propose a paper at these conferences. You can submit your own research, your own original research, and more often than not, it does get attention.
The point we were trying to make. One of the problems
I've had with that approach is that I'm often told I don't even do economics. Because the profession, unfortunately, rather than defining the economics they do as neoclassical or mainstream economics, they define it as economics. So anything that's not that, they tend to think of that as not being economics. So if I submitted my research to the American Economic Review, it wouldn't be considered economics. It would be rejected out of hand. So the problem is the debate's gotten really narrowed, and then what's happened is the professors have only studied mainstream economics, so they don't know about the other theories. So that's where we as a profession really need to work on pluralism and opening our minds up and tolerance for difference and accepting the existence of different models, whatever works, whatever helps us understand.
Well, Julie, I'd absolutely agree on the need to open some of the top journals. I mean, there was a big debate a few years ago. A question was asked, could Adam Smith, who's recognized as kind of the philosophical founder of the economics discipline.
British as well.
Oh, yeah, Scottish-British, but...
1776, The Wealth of Nations.
Absolutely.
Why are we not live on the main TV show right now so people could go, she's awesome, how does she know that?
Adam Smith. And the big question is, could he get published in the American Economics Review?
Because he wasn't strictly...
N-O.
he didn't write in the way that economists write. Okay.
So we do become captivated to mathematical models. So yes, I'm completely open to that broadening of the debate, but we need to have that broadening occur within the journals, or we need to found other journals that that can bring that research to bear, rather than saying disrupting a panel that's going on at a conference.
Unfortunately, there's a need first to try to shift the conversation. So if our voices aren't being heard, and the people who are running those journals and running those conferences aren't willing to actually permit a legitimate debate between different contending schools of thought, then we need to protest that. We need to speak out, and we need to feel free to have forms of discussion that aren't constricted by a very limited worldview.
It's been really fascinating getting a little insight into your worldview and also your field. Phil and Julie and Keith and Sebastian, thank you for being really kind to us and keeping the jargon at the minimum. Really appreciate that, and really appreciate the discussion. One more place to go to before I wrap up, Malika.
Well, all of our guests today talked about widening the scope of debate. And one place that we all know the debate is very wide is online. So I'm going to share two comments. This one is from Sarah, who says, Western capitalism does not work because its foundation is injustice and inequality. On the other hand, though, you have this side of the debate. This is on Facebook from Giovanni, who says, maybe capitalism isn't the best economic system we have, but one thing I'm 100% sure about, it is our best option. It brought us our sense of freedom, democracy, and private property.
All right, guests, all take a breath. I know you have a comment to add to that, but we are wrapping up the show. Thank you so much for being part of this conversation. Meanwhile, on the next AJ stream, Muslims visiting the Holy Land are being called traitors by fellow Muslims. We'll tell you why and look at the online debate that's revolving around this very controversial program. We'll be doing that on the next AJ stream. See you soon.